In the year 382, the Roman Emperor Gratian did something that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. He ordered the removal of the altar of victory from the Roman Senate House, a sacred fixture that had stood there for over 400 years, since the time of Augustus. Senators had burned incense at that altar before every session. They'd sworn oaths on it. And now, with one imperial decree, it was gone. Here's the thing, though. When it happened, most of the Senate barely flinched. The old gods were abandoned, slowly and quietly, by a civilization that had simply moved on. The fall of Roman paganism was like a dimmer on a set of lights, turned down over the course of roughly 3 centuries. But even today, we are still left with the open question of why these gods, who had once served the Romans so well, were ultimately abandoned. Roman religion wasn't a faith in the modern sense. There was no sacred text, no central doctrine, no requirement to believe anything in particular. Roman religion was essentially transactional, in that you made offerings to the gods, and in return, you expected their favor. The formal term for this relationship was the Pax Deorum, or in English, the peace of the gods. The belief was that you keep the gods happy, and the state prospers, but if you neglect them, bad things happen. This worked brilliantly for centuries, mostly because Roman religion was flexible enough to absorb almost anything. Conquered a new territory with unusual gods that Roman society didn't have? Simply adopt them into the pantheon. Encounter a foreign cult that gains popularity with Roman citizens and soldiers? There was a similar solution. Find a Roman equivalent and say that it was really the same thing all along. The pantheon was less a rigid system and more a sprawling, open-source network of divine obligations. But that flexibility came with a cost. There wasn't much there to hold on to when something more compelling came along. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, the cracks were already showing in fairly major ways. Rome's traditional religion had always been better at public ritual than private meaning. As the empire expanded and urbanized, people increasingly wanted something that spoke to them personally. Mystery cults, such as that of Mithras, had been filling that gap for generations, offering initiation rites, personal salvation, and a sense of belonging. Christianity, which had been growing steadily since the 1st century, offered all of that and then a little more as well. It had a coherent theology, a clear moral framework, a promise of life after death, and crucially, a community structure that functioned like a social safety net. Early Christian congregations took care of their sick, buried their dead, and fed their poor. They organized networks of charity that crossed ethnic and class boundaries in ways Roman civic institutions never had. In an empire where the state had declined to the point where it provided little of this for ordinary people, that mattered enormously. By the mid-3rd century, Christians may have represented somewhere between 2 and 3% of the empire's total population. That sounds tiny. But they were disproportionately concentrated in cities, well organized, and remarkably resilient. The persecutions under emperors like Decius and Diocletian, brutal as they were, failed to stamp the movement out. If anything, the martyrdoms only strengthened it. The blood of the martyrs, as the early Christian writer Tertullian reportedly put it, watered the seed of the church. Then came Constantine, and everything changed. In 312, on the eve of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine reportedly saw a vision, a cross of light in the sky, accompanied by the words, "In this sign, conquer." Whether he actually saw anything or simply made a calculated political decision is a question historians have debated for 17 centuries. What's not debatable is what happened next. He won the battle, credited the Christian God, and set the empire on an irreversible course. The Edict of Milan the following year didn't make Christianity the state religion. That's a common misconception, but its effect would have a major impact on Roman paganism. What it did was legalize Christianity and grant it equal status with other religions. But Constantine went further than mere tolerance, and he poured imperial funds into church construction and granted clergy tax exemptions. He also inserted himself into theological disputes like the Council of Nicaea in 325, where he attempted to shape Christianity in a way that made it beneficial to the state. The old pagan institutions didn't vanish overnight, but they were now competing with a rival that had the emperor's imperial treasury behind it. Temple revenues were gradually redirected, and pagan priesthoods slowly lost their public funding. Constantine's sons, particularly Constantius II, went further still, ordering the closure of some temples and banning sacrifices in certain regions. The economic and political infrastructure of traditional religion was being quietly dismantled, even while many of the temples themselves still stood open. There was one significant attempt to reverse the tide. In 361, Constantine's nephew Julian became emperor and immediately set about restoring paganism, earning him the nickname Julian the Apostate. He reopened temples, reinstated pagan priesthoods, and tried to build a pagan church structure modeled on the Christian one, complete with charitable institutions and a hierarchy of priests. He even wrote or had commissioned a philosophical treatise arguing against Christianity called Against the Galileans. Unfortunately, it only survives in small fragments because later Christian authors preserved just enough of it to refute. Julian's project was ambitious, intellectually serious, and ultimately doomed. He ruled for less than 2 years before dying on campaign against the Persians in 363. His pagan revival died with him, and no subsequent emperor would attempt anything similar. But the truth is that Julian's real problem wasn't a lack of time, it was a lack of believers. The educated pagan elite he was counting on had largely already hedged their bets or outright converted to Christianity. The grassroots enthusiasm simply wasn't there from the class of people who had the ability to institute such changes. After Julian, the trajectory was virtually entirely one-directional. Emperor Theodosius I delivered the decisive blows. In 380 AD, the Edict of Thessalonica declared Christianity the official state religion of the Roman Empire. It wasn't just one of many legal religions anymore. It was the religion of the empire, but for a time, paganism would still be legal. That changed in the early 390s when Theodosius issued a series of decrees that effectively banned pagan worship altogether. Public sacrifices were outlawed and temples were closed and converted into churches. The eternal flame of the Vestal Virgins, which had been tended continuously for over 1,000 years, was extinguished, and the Vestals were disbanded. This was the period that saw the destruction of the Serapeum in Alexandria, one of the ancient world's most magnificent pagan temples, reportedly demolished by a mob in 391. The Serapeum had housed a satellite collection of the Great Library and served as a center of pagan intellectual life for centuries, and its destruction sent a clear message. Across the empire, statues of gods were toppled, defaced, or simply left to decay. The physical infrastructure of paganism was being systematically erased from the landscape. But here's where it gets interesting. Outlawing something and actually ending it are two very different things. Paganism didn't die when Theodosius said it should. It lingered, especially in the countryside. The Latin word paganus, from which we get pagan, originally meant something like country dweller or rustic, and there's a reason for that. Rural communities were the last holdouts, clinging to old festivals, sacred groves, and local shrines long after the cities had gone Christian. The Church spent centuries trying to stamp out these practices, often by simply absorbing them. They rebranded pagan festivals as Christian feast days, built churches on top of old sacred sites, and associated local deities with specific saints. In the Eastern Empire, the famous Academy of Athens, the philosophical school that traced its lineage back to Plato, continued to operate as a bastion of pagan thought. That was until Emperor Justinian shut it down in 529, a date that's sometimes cited as the symbolic end of classical paganism, though even that's debatable. Archaeological evidence from across the Mediterranean suggests that pagan practices persisted in isolated pockets well into the 6th and 7th centuries. In the Western Empire, the picture is even messier and muddier. The Franks, Goths, and other Germanic peoples who carved up the western provinces brought their own gods with them. From there, they created a complicated patchwork of Christian, Roman pagan, and Germanic pagan traditions that took centuries to fully sort out. So when did the Romans actually stop believing? The clear answer is that there was nothing approaching a single moment, as much as historians have tried to argue otherwise. It was a process that stretched from roughly the mid-3rd century to the late 6th century, over 300 years of gradual, uneven, and often messy transition. The emperors provided the political framework, and the bishops provided the institutional muscle. The ordinary people, on the other hand, made their own decisions based on community, conviction, and, let's be frank, which side had more to offer. To me, though, what's striking isn't that Rome abandoned its gods. It's how little resistance the old religion ultimately put up. Aside from Julian the Apostate, there was no serious pushback, and even that limited resistance was virtually completely wiped out by his successors. A system built on ritual obligation rather than personal faith turned out to be remarkably fragile when a more personal and more structurally resilient alternative came along. In the end, it seems that the traditional gods of Rome simply lost their audience. 10,000 Roman soldiers marched into the Arabian desert in 26 BC chasing frankincense and glory, and the desert swallowed them whole. Not in some dramatic last stand and not in a pitched battle against an overwhelming enemy. If the sources are to be believed, they lost just 7 men in combat across the entire campaign. The rest, thousands of men, died of thirst, disease, and a mysterious illness that paralyzed their mouths and then their legs, all while being deliberately led in circles. This is the story of how the ambition of Augustus Caesar collided head-on with the Arabian Peninsula, and how the peninsula won without really even trying. You may wonder why Rome sent an army into one of the most inhospitable landscapes on Earth, a place known to the Romans as Arabia Felix. The name itself translates roughly to Fortunate Arabia or Happy Arabia, and it wasn't intended to be ironic. The southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, roughly modern-day Yemen, sat at the heart of one of the ancient world's most lucrative trade networks. Frankincense and myrrh, both tree resins harvested almost exclusively in southern Arabia, Ethiopia, and Somalia, were essential commodities in Roman religious and daily life. Romans burned frankincense at temples, at funerals, and in their homes, while myrrh, on the other hand, went into medicines, perfumes, and embalming preparations. By some estimates, southern Arabia was shipping over 3,000 tons of frankincense annually to Greece and Rome at the trade's peak. The problem, from Rome's perspective, was that every ounce of it passed through a series of middlemen. Arab merchants ran camel caravans along the incense route from modern Yemen to the Mediterranean, and each stop along the way added another markup. By the time a lump of frankincense reached a Roman market, its price had been inflated several times over. Augustus, fresh off consolidating his grip on Egypt following the deaths of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, looked south across the Red Sea and saw a golden opportunity. If Rome could control the source, or at least establish direct trading relationships, it could cut out the middlemen entirely. The man he chose for this job was Aelius Gallus, the second prefect of Roman Egypt. Gallus began his preparations in earnest, commissioning 130 transport vessels to be constructed at Cleopatris. This was near the old canal connecting the Nile to the Red Sea in the vicinity of modern Suez. The force he assembled was substantial, around 10,000 infantry drawn from Roman legions stationed in Egypt and allied contingents. These allied troops included around 1,000 Nabatean soldiers, and they were key to the whole enterprise. Based in Petra, they controlled the northern stretches of the incense trade routes and, at least in theory, possessed invaluable knowledge of Arabian geography and tribal politics. The Nabatean king, Obotus III, provided a guide and minister named Sylleus, who was to lead the Roman army through the desert to the incense-producing regions. On the surface, Gallus had every reason to trust him. The Nabateans were ostensibly Roman allies, and Sylleus presented himself as cooperative and knowledgeable. But here's the thing. The Nabateans had absolutely no interest in Rome gaining direct access to the frankincense trade. Their entire economy depended on being the middlemen that Augustus wanted to eliminate, and Sylleus was less a guide and more a saboteur. The expedition launched from Cleopatris and immediately ran into trouble. The Red Sea, treacherous at the best of times for ancient vessels, battered the fleet badly. Storms wrecked several ships and others were driven onto reefs. By the time Gallus's diminished flotilla limped into a Nabatean trading port on the Arabian coast, 14 days had passed, and he'd already lost a significant portion of his transport capacity. The plan had originally called for a naval approach down the coast, but the ship losses made that impossible. Gallus had no choice but to commit to a land march through terrain he didn't understand, relying entirely on a guide who was actively working against him. The army spent the rest of the summer and the following winter at the port town of Luqaqam, a now lost location believed to be in what is now far northwestern Saudi Arabia. Gallus and company spent time regrouping and dealing with an outbreak of disease that Strabo, the Greek geographer, attributed to the local water and food. Strabo's account remains our most detailed primary source for the expedition, in large part because he and Gallus had traveled together in Egypt and were close friends. The geographer describes the illness as attacking the mouth first, causing a kind of paralysis, and then descending to the legs. Modern scholars have speculated this may have been scurvy or some nutritional deficiency disease, aggravated by unfamiliar water sources. However, others have speculated that the group may have been poisoned, perhaps by their so-called guide, though there's no direct evidence to confirm this. When the march finally resumed, Sylleus's treachery became the defining feature of the campaign. Rather than leading the army along established trade routes, he guided them through wastelands and took unnecessary detours. Strabo, writing in his geography, explicitly accuses Sylleus of acting as an undercover agent against the Romans. Cassius Dio, the Roman historian writing his account somewhat later, echoes this assessment. He noted that a journey that should have taken roughly 60 days was dragged out to 6 months. The army pressed through territory controlled by various hostile Arab tribes, then spent 50 grueling days crossing unmarked desert before reaching Najran. Najran is a city presently located in Saudi Arabia, near the border of modern Yemen, and notably, it's far inland. This is, of course, despite the fact that they could have simply hugged the coast for a much easier trip, again lending credibility to their guide working against them. From there, they fought their way through local resistance, reportedly defeating an army and slaying around 10,000 defenders in a pitched engagement near a river. They captured a town called Aska after its king fled, and then took another settlement, Athrula, without a fight. Gallus stationed a garrison there, arranged grain and water supplies, and pushed further south toward the jewel of Arabia Felix. That prize was a city that Strabo calls Marsyaba, widely identified by historians as Marib, the ancient capital of the Sabaean kingdom. The city was, by all accounts, the keystone of Arabia Felix. It sat at the nexus of the incense routes, and its great dam sustained agriculture in an otherwise arid landscape. If Gallus could take Marib, the expedition would have been a success by any measure. He reached its high walls, and that's where things fell apart for good. After 6 days besieging Marib, Gallus was forced to confront a brutal reality. His army was dying, and not from enemy arrows. Water was desperately scarce, and that mysterious disease continued to spread through the ranks once again. His supply lines, to the extent they even existed, were stretched impossibly thin across hundreds of miles of hostile desert, and couldn't sustain a prolonged siege. What happened next remains a historical mystery, though most sources seem to believe he launched a successful last-ditch assault on the city. However, the one source who differs, as I'll discuss in a moment, was Strabo, who actually knew Gallus, suggesting that this is where the Romans stopped. From there, the sources disagree on exactly how far south the Romans got and what exactly they did. Cassius Dio claims they reached a city called Athrula, though the location of this city, if it exists, is a complete mystery. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, argues Gallus pushed as far as a place called Carapeta, another location that may not actually exist. Once again, Strabo, who I need to stress, actually knew the man and was personal friends with him, insists they got no further than Marsyaba. It's unclear how such conflicting stories came to be, especially given that Strabo had a rare first-hand account of the leader of the expedition. Ultimately, whatever the case, Gallus made the only rational decision left to him, and he turned around. The retreat tells you everything you need to know about Silius's deception. The return journey to the northern coast of the Red Sea, where the journey began, took just 60 days as opposed to 6 months. The army that finally crossed the Red Sea back into Egypt was a shadow of the force that had departed. Disease, hunger, heat, and exhaustion had gutted it. The total combat dead for the entire expedition reportedly numbered just 7 men. Everything else was the desert and the betrayal. Strabo, for his part, laid the blame squarely on Silius and tried to shield his friend's reputation. The portrayal of Gallus as a competent commander undone by treachery has dominated the historical narrative ever since. And as you can likely tell, it's significantly influenced how I've approached and analyzed this historical journey as well. That said, it's worth noting that Strabo wasn't exactly a disinterested observer, given that he was a close personal friend of Gallus and had reason to make his friend look good. Further, his source on the matter was Gallus himself. So even if he tried to approach the situation somewhat objectively, he couldn't simply go and interview Silius for his account. Some modern scholars have questioned whether Gallus himself bore more responsibility for poor planning. Notably, Gallus had commissioned warships for the expedition which were woefully inadequate for the Red Sea. Even if the narrative that Silius was a saboteur is accurate, Gallus also seems to have placed significant trust into a man he ought to have known had competing interests. I suspect a more adept commander may have been able to root out this apparent treachery at some point, while being led around in circles. And speaking of Silius, I'm sure that you're all expecting that he met some sort of brutal end for his apparent betrayal of the Romans. And just to be clear, The Romans would ultimately put his head up on the chopping block, but I'll get to that in a moment. Remarkably, despite this disastrous expedition, he went on to thrive politically for a significant period of time, interacting with some of the most famous people in history. He rose in the Nabatean hierarchy and served as an ambassador to Judea, where he reportedly had a highly public affair with Herod the Great's sister Salome. The two even wished to get married, but Herod wouldn't allow it unless Silius abandoned his native religion and converted to Judaism. Silius wasn't willing to give up the religion of his ancestors, and so the marriage was never to be. After that, he continued operating as Nabatea's representative in Roman diplomatic circles, but his luck ran out eventually, as it tends to. He was executed in Rome around 6 BC, though the charges were apparently related to his broader political machinations rather than the Arabia expedition specifically. Emperor Augustus, characteristically for a man who was the adoptive son of Julius Caesar, spun the disaster as a success. In his Res Gestae, the great autobiographical inscription cataloging his achievements, he mentions the Arabian campaign in terms that suggest territorial gains. He wasn't entirely lying, and the army had won its battles and governed territory in the region very briefly. But the strategic objective, direct Roman control over the incense trade routes, was a complete failure. The expedition to Arabia Felix stands as one of the most striking examples of Rome reaching the limits of what its military machine could accomplish. The legions could meet and defeat any conventional army put in front of them, and they proved it repeatedly in Arabia. But they couldn't defeat geography, poor logistics, and the calculated treachery of an ally who understood that some trade routes are worth more than any treaty. Rome, in essence, lost due to attrition rather than anything else, leading historians to question why such a poorly planned expedition was even launched in the first place. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here asking you to hit the like and subscribe button if you're enjoying my content. There's over 100 videos in this historical mysteries series, so remember to check them out after this video. Also, don't forget that you can check out the YouTube membership or the Patreon to support my channel further. We've spent roughly 2,500 years assuming the ancient Greeks were true believers in their own mythology, that they heard the stories of Zeus hurling thunderbolts and Poseidon shaking the earth and nodded along, and while this is a comfortable picture, it's almost entirely wrong. The reality is that Greek intellectuals were picking apart their own religious narratives for centuries. This is the story of how the relationship between the average Greek citizen and the gods was far stranger and more complicated than most people realize. The earliest recorded pushback against Greek myth didn't come from an outsider to the tradition, looking to undermine a core element of ancient Greek culture. In fact, it came from within the culture itself, and it came much earlier than you would expect. In the 6th century BC, a poet and thinker named Xenophanes of Colophon launched what might be the first sustained intellectual critique of anthropomorphic religion in Western history. His argument was devastatingly simple. Humans invent gods that look like themselves. He pointed out that the Thracians imagined their gods with red hair and blue eyes, while the Ethiopians depicted theirs with dark skin. He went further, suggesting that if horses and cattle had hands and could paint, they'd draw gods that looked like horses and cattle. And this thinker wasn't some fringe crank shouting into the void. He was widely read, widely discussed, and his ideas rippled outward through Greek intellectual life for centuries. Around the same period, early Greek natural philosophers were already proposing non-divine explanations for phenomena that myth had traditionally attributed to the gods. Thales of Miletus argued that earthquakes weren't caused by Poseidon's trident, but by the earth floating on water. Anaximander proposed that life originated from moisture acted upon by the sun, not from the creative whims of Prometheus and some hunks of clay. These thinkers weren't atheists in the modern sense, but they were systematically removing the gods from their explanatory role in the natural world. This is arguably more radical than simply denying they exist, since it suggests that even if they do, the Greeks may not have it right. If anyone illustrates the complexity of Greek attitudes toward myth, it's Plato. On one hand, he was arguably the most influential religious thinker in the Greek tradition. On the other, he wanted to ban Homer and Hesiod from his ideal city. His objection wasn't that the myths were false in some literal sense. His problem was that they depicted the gods behaving badly, engaging in deception, jealousy, adultery, and violence. He believed these stories corrupted the moral character of citizens who heard them. In his Republic, he proposed a radical program of censorship. Only myths that portrayed the gods as perfectly good and perfectly rational would be permitted. What's fascinating here is that Plato didn't reject myth as a form. He actually invented his own myths, elaborate allegorical stories designed to communicate philosophical truths he felt couldn't be expressed through pure argument alone. He understood that narrative had a power that logic alone didn't, and he wanted to harness that power while stripping away what he saw as the moral corruption of the traditional stories. He wanted a deliberate project of myth reform that took storytelling seriously, precisely because it understood how deeply those stories shaped a culture's moral imagination. If Zeus behaved like a monster, it was, in essence, a license for average Greeks to behave in much the same way. This idea was, in essence, that the stories of the gods had been corrupted by humans who wanted to act poorly or justify their tyrannical rule. The tension between myth and evidence found its sharpest expression in the work of Greek historians. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, treated myth with a kind of respectful agnosticism. He'd report what various peoples believed, sometimes noting that he personally found certain stories implausible, but he rarely dismissed them outright. He was essentially saying that he'd pass the story along, but the listener could make up their own mind about whether it actually happened. Thucydides took things considerably further. Writing just a generation after Herodotus, he essentially declared that anything that couldn't be verified through testimony or evidence wasn't worth including in serious historical writing. He explicitly distanced his work from what he called the mythical, arguing that his account of the Peloponnesian War would be less entertaining than the stories told by writers before him. But he believed it would be far more useful to anyone who wanted to understand human nature and political reality, and ultimately, in the end, we know he was right in this assessment. This was, effectively, a 5th century BC historian telling his audience that the age of taking myths at face value was over. That is, at least for anyone interested in understanding how the world actually worked, rather than those who simply wanted a good narrative to listen to. But here's the thing. Elite intellectual skepticism is one thing. What about the average person in Athens or Corinth or Thebes? This is where it gets genuinely interesting, because the evidence suggests that even ordinary Greeks didn't relate to their myths the way we might assume. Ritual practice, not doctrinal belief, was the foundation of Greek religion. There was no sacred scripture. You weren't expected to believe specific theological propositions. You were expected to participate in festivals, pour libations, make sacrifices, and honor the gods through action. Whether you personally believed that Athena had literally sprung fully armed from Zeus's skull was, in a functional sense, beside the point. This created a religious culture that was remarkably tolerant of variation in personal belief. A farmer in a rural area, with effectively no access to education, might have taken the myths quite literally. A merchant in Athens who'd attended a few philosophical lectures might have understood them as allegories that existed to explain, rather than literal accounts. A priestess at Delphi might have believed that she literally could interact with divine forces directly, and may have had extreme faith in the reality of the gods. Yet none of them would have been branded a heretic for their particular interpretation, because the concept of heresy as a religious offense essentially didn't exist in Greek religion. What mattered was orthopraxy, right practice, not orthodoxy, right belief, and there was, in essence, no orthodoxy anyway. By the Hellenistic period, roughly the 3rd century BC, skepticism toward myth had become something close to an intellectual industry. A writer named Euhemerus published a work in which he argued that the gods had originally been human kings and heroes whose deeds were gradually exaggerated. Over the generations, he proposed, the original human seed was lost, and they were worshipped as purely divine beings. Zeus, in his telling, was most likely actually a mortal ruler of Crete who'd been deified after his passing. This approach, which later scholars would term Euhemerism, became enormously influential and essentially provided a framework for treating mythology as distorted history. The Stoic philosophers took yet another approach, reading the myths as allegories for natural processes. Zeus represented the sky, Hera the air, Hephaestus fire, and other gods represented other elements or natural forces. The Epicureans, meanwhile, argued that the gods existed, but were completely indifferent to human affairs. This effectively rendered the entire mythological tradition, with its stories of divine intervention and punishment, irrelevant to daily life. By the time Rome absorbed Greek culture, the intellectual toolkit for dismantling myth was remarkably well developed. Greek thinkers had, across several centuries, developed virtually every strategy for rationalizing, allegorizing, historicizing, or simply dismissing traditional mythology. For their part, the Romans, being much more conventionally religious, generally viewed these outlooks on the gods with extreme suspicion. The question of whether the Greeks believed their own myths turns out to be the wrong question entirely. The more accurate question is, which Greeks, during which period, and what do we even mean by belief? The ancient Greek world contained committed skeptics, casual agnostics, devout practitioners, philosophical allegorists, and everything in between. Their relationship with myth was less like a modern person's relationship with religious doctrine and more like our own complicated relationship with national founding stories. We retell them, we celebrate them, we build institutions around them, and we simultaneously understand that the literal details are, at best, heavily embroidered. The Greeks didn't just invent philosophy, after all. They also invented religious doubt, and they did it with a rigor that still holds up remarkably well today. Zhuangzi gave the world one of philosophy's most haunting images. A man who dreamt he was a butterfly, and when he wakes up, he wonders if his entire life he had simply been a butterfly, dreaming he was a man. But the deeper irony is this: the philosopher behind that dream may himself be little more than a literary device dreamed up by later scholars. We have no contemporary witness to his life, no solid trail of evidence, just a book, a few fragile anecdotes, and a biography so thin it barely counts. Like so many things in Chinese history, the earliest account we have comes from the records of the Grand Historian, composed around 94 BC by the Han Dynasty court historian Sima Qian. This is the single most important historical text in the Chinese tradition, covering roughly 2,500 years of history. It's the closest thing we have to an authoritative source on Zhuangzi's life. But here's the thing. The biography is shockingly brief. Sima Qian tells us that Zhuangzi was a minor official from the town of Meng in the state of Song, and that he lived during the late 4th century BC. His name, according to the great historian, was Zhuang Zhou, with his more familiar name simply meaning Master Zhuang. It's noted in the biography that his philosophical thought was drawn primarily from the teachings of Lao Tzu, a fact that will be important later. As I'll discuss, a later scholar significantly edited Zhuangzi's work, and this passage confirms at the very least that it was always a fundamentally Taoist text. Sima Qian also references a text of roughly 100,000 characters attributed to Zhuangzi, and that's essentially the whole biography. The problem of evidence gets more severe when you realize that his source for almost everything used by Sima Qian is the Zhuangzi, the self-titled book attributed to the master himself. In other words, the biography is largely just a summary of the book, with no independent sources used. If the biographical evidence is thin, the textual evidence is genuinely complex. The Zhuangzi, as we know it today, is a 33-chapter work divided into 3 sections. The inner chapters, which comprise the first 7, the outer chapters spanning 8 through 22, and the miscellaneous chapters from 23 through 33. But this arrangement isn't original. It's the product of an editorial intervention that took place roughly 600 years after the text was supposedly written. Around 300 AD, a scholar named Guo Xiang took a version of the Zhuangzi that reportedly contained 52 chapters and cut it down to 33. He removed material he considered questionable and imposed his own philosophical preferences on what remained. Guo Xiang's edition is the only complete version that survives today, and everything that came before his editorial scissors is lost, except in brief reference. So when we read the Zhuangzi, we're reading a text that was already philosophically filtered by a man who lived more than half a millennium after the supposed author. The traditional view holds that the inner chapters, those first 7, represent the authentic voice of Master Zhuang himself. The outer and miscellaneous chapters were composed by later followers and editors. Modern scholarship has broadly upheld this division, but with significant complications. Careful linguistic and philosophical analysis of the text has identified at least 5 distinct authorial voices across the 33 chapters. The historical Zhuangzi, if he existed, accounts for only one of those voices. Some scholars have taken a strongly skeptical position, arguing that there's no reliable historical data for Zhuangzi at all. Others maintain that the philosophical coherence and distinctive literary voice of the inner chapters point strongly toward a single, historically real author. The mainstream position tends to fall somewhere in the middle. Most scholars accept that a historical figure named Zhuang Zhou probably existed in the state of Song during the 4th century BC. They also accept that he was likely responsible for at least some of the material in the inner chapters. Personally, I think the most interesting thing here isn't really whether Zhuangzi was one person or many. It's the irony. The Zhuangzi is a text that's obsessed with the instability of identity, with the idea that the boundaries between self and other are far less solid than we'd like to believe. I opened with that famous passage where Zhuangzi dreams he's a butterfly, and then wakes up unsure whether he's a man who dreamed of being a butterfly or a butterfly now dreaming it's a man. For a philosopher whose central insight was that identity is fluid and categories are illusions, the fact that his own identity has dissolved into historical uncertainty feels almost poetic. The man who told us the self is an illusion became one, and maybe, in a way only Zhuangzi would appreciate, that's the whole point.